So we were talking about different rubrics to compare the relative advantages or disadvantages between the Danish and Dutch approaches. So one could say, one could think when it comes to boundaries for assessment that it is a disadvantage of the Dutch approach that it only looks at embodied emissions, but that's going to change anyway, as I understand. Whereas the Danish approach looks at the whole life carbon emissions. But when we look at the impact categories, the Dutch approach obviously is more holistic, which from an environmental perspective is advantageous, and the Danish approach more narrow. The Dutch approach seems to be less aligned with the European taxonomy, as it takes assumes the lifetime of homes is 75 years. So that's less aligned, and also here the operational emissions become more important. 50 years, as in the Danish approach, seems to be more aligned with the taxonomy, but it's also in a way less realistic, because home builders will not realistically assume that the home only lasts for 50 years. But on the other hand, this also increases the impact of embodied emissions, which could be a good thing. In terms of complexity, the Dutch approach is more complex. The Danish approach is less complex. At the same time, because you have more impact categories, and across the impact categories, some of the impact categories are marked by higher uncertainty. Overall, the uncertainty of the Dutch approach is higher, whereas the uncertainty of the Danish approach is lower. Data transparency seems to be relatively low in the Dutch approach. So you have more reliance on internal mechanisms, less on published EPDs. And it's interesting. So somebody was saying that maybe the publication of the EPD seems to be too expensive for the companies. And then we were linking this back to the Inflation Reduction Act, where you have lots of support for companies to publish EPDs. And in the Danish approach, the data transparency is relatively high, with a rapid rise in the number of EPDs, which then also benefits the customers of Danish companies. There was a critique of a kind of problematic equation of local and global impact. So we heard about the particular concern in the Netherlands about eutrophication and nitrogen emissions, but some of those emissions are, if you import building materials, those emissions occur somewhere else. So it's not necessarily, although it's a problem in the Netherlands, and so you want to put more weight on it. If you import these building materials, maybe those are less of a concern for the places where you import the materials from. And because you take more environmental impact categories into account in the Danish and on the Dutch approach, sorry, then you have less of a problem of potentially unintended environmental consequences. And this was kind of difficult to put into a rubric. So there was this idea of shadow pricing, which you have with this conversion into euro in the Dutch approach, and what I call purely natural dimensions, so square meters and years, and so on. So the Dutch approach is relatable in the terms of you refer to euro value, but it's also more dynamically complex. Let's think about inflation and changes in the weighting of different impact categories, and can be a bit more confusing because of that, whereas the Danish approach is more straightforward, scientific. And then we were talking about the openness for different databases, and I maybe you want to correct us here. So it seemed to people in our group that the Dutch approach only accepts EcoInvent, one of the lifecycle databases, one of the lifecycle inventory databases, and Dutch EPDs, and there's no mutual EPD recognition with other programs, whereas in the Danish approach, they accept both EcoInvent, Gabi, and there's mutual recognition with other EPD programs.
We discussed both the Dutch and Danish side. just to avoid confusion, we had a bit of an exercise in which people wrote down Dutch challenges they could think of on orange paper and Danish challenges on blue paper. And then we try to compare and contrast, okay, what are challenges for the Dutch case, what are challenges for the Danish case? Maybe there are actually challenges for both of them. Yeah, I think the main challenge had to do with the harmonization of the policies, kind of the scaling up to other countries as well. There was a lot of agreement on both the advantages, the positives of the Danish case in terms of using limit values for global warming, GWP, and also for the Dutch case for using a more holistic approach, 19 different indicators, or soon to be 90 different indicators. However, that did bring up the discussion of how do we actually harmonize all of those indicators. Is it even possible to use the same weight for all of those different environmental indicators? And then if it's not, is that then a disadvantage, or is it actually fine if there's different weighting of all those indicators? This also brought the discussion on, okay, what is actually the role of those limit values? I don't know if you'll say. No. Yeah, so I think that's the question that we spend a lot of time on as well. So it's about the differences in the approach to the limit values to drive the decarbonization. I think one advantage of having that harmonization possible would be the additional support from the industry and bring additional investment, is what we discussed. So I will leave the harmonization at that and move on to another one. One question that we also had was, where do the people actually have to submit data in order to show that they comply with the limit values? We discussed that you could do it at the project phase. You could also do it at the build phase later on. And we actually discussed that regardless, even if you do it at the build phase, it kind of indirectly already pushes the actors to make informed decisions in the project phase already as well. So in that sense, both of these already push informed decisions. The thing that we did discuss shortly as well is that digitalization is going to be a huge challenge both for the Dutch case and the Danish case, in terms of how you have to use the data, because you gain a lot of data and you need to almost see if they comply with the limit values. And that's very hard to do if you don't have a digital skeleton in place in order to do that. And it will cost a lot of money and time, especially as well, in order to do that. So the digitalization was a big aspect as well of how to put that in place in order to quicken, make it a quicker process and easier process as well. Anything to add? No. What we also discussed is the integration with the taxonomy. Let's see, and also the different supply chains. Yeah, that's maybe an interesting one to discuss as well. We had a discussion about how important is it to have all the data from the value chain that is international. Like, how much does that influence the decisions that need to be made? So instead of maybe looking at the whole supply chain, looking at hotspots of material location, so that's maybe like the quickest answer to it. But of course, there's different opinions on how to best calculate that. Yeah, lots of challenges, mostly for both. The challenges exist for both of the Dutch and Danish cases are the same ones. Yeah, it's just that they made slightly different decisions in the policy design. But even so, you have similar challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing to add is thanks everybody for a very lively discussion. And it seems like it was also very lively on the online part. And I think we've all learned a lot about both cases. And we'll try and see how we can implement it elsewhere and jump some of these challenges without having the strong base that Netherlands and Denmark have.
I think one last point. I think that's what you just said is also really important. A lot of the positives of these cases, they can happen because there's already a strong base of information within these countries. For example, with the different indicators and the weighing of it. If you take away that base, it's very hard to have that in place. So if you want to scale it up to different countries, then it's hard to do so without that base already in place. Yeah.